All right, well, good morning, everybody. It's 9:30, we're ready to begin. You can see this morning we're going to start into the book of Romans. Perhaps Paul's most famous letter, and one that we're probably somewhat familiar with. A lot of people would use this as an excuse to dive into a 86-week study of the book of Romans, and for good reason. It's a place where you have lots of material to get into. You could spend your lifetime digging into Romans, I think, and find new things all the time. But today we're going to spend 45 minutes on the book of Romans. We've got so much more to talk about with Paul, so we'll get a survey here and give you something to dig into on your own. So just to maybe start us off with a question, why does Paul write to Rome? Now, the letters we've studied so far that he's written, if we're going chronologically, Galatians, he's writing to the churches of Galatia where he had just established these churches, and now they're having some problems, and he is addressing those problems. He wrote the letters to Thessalonica. He had just been there, started those churches. He's writing because he knows they're facing this persecution that pushed him out of the city himself. So he is responding to the problems of churches that he has just been at. And in Corinth, we've studied 1st and 2nd Corinthians, it's the same thing. He had just been in Corinth, has just started these churches, and now he is responding to the issues that they're having. We'll get to Romans, and now this is a church that Paul has never been to, and it appears, because he doesn't have that connection, that he's not responding to any issues in the church in Rome. So why does he choose Rome? He's got this idea, he's been thinking through this righteousness and faith. I want to work something up about that, and where should I send that? Rome. He just picks it off a map or something. Probably not. Why does Paul choose this city? It's in some sense a logical place. It's the capital of the empire. But why does he pick Rome to send or to receive this document outlining his theology of the gospel? Well, if you actually maybe look at it a little bit, Romans 15, he tells them, now there is no more place for me to work in these regions. He's thinking Greece and Turkey, where he's been starting churches before. Since I've been longing for many years to visit you, I plan to do so when I go to Spain. I hope to see you while passing through and to have you assist me on my journey there after I've enjoyed your company for a while. So we get a hint here about what Paul is thinking, that he's been working in Asia, Galatia, Macedonia, Achaia. Those are areas of Greece and Turkey, but he feels like the work is finished for him. Obviously, the work of the church is never going to be completely finished, but his role in bringing the gospel to these new frontiers, he feels like he's done that. And now there's other places where the gospel is completely unknown, that he feels like that's his next opportunity. And his idea is Spain, which is going to be quite a challenge for him. Working in Turkey and Greece, the language of communication there has been Greek, which he has been very familiar with. But if you get to Spain, they're not going to be speaking Greek anymore. He's going to be having some challenges if he succeeds in this. And he views Rome, anyway, as sort of the stopping point on the way to Spain, that he can meet the church there, spend time with them, and then go on to his next destination. So if you view it this way, Romans is sort of a letter of introduction to this church that he is using to say, here I am, here's what I think, and I'm hoping to be able to visit with you soon. And because he's not responding to any problems, we get this amazing document that outlines his thought about things just without applying it to any specific problems, just in general. He does continue here. Now, however, I'm on my way to Jerusalem in the service of the Lord's people there. From Macedonia, that's northern Greece, and Achaia, southern Greece, we're pleased to make a contribution for the poor among the Lord's people in Jerusalem. So we've been talking about this for several weeks now as well. And he's got this idea in his head that he wants to raise a collection for the Christians in Jerusalem. And he's been traveling all around the Mediterranean, raising money for this project. And so now he's got this last thing. He's got to deliver the money. He just needs to drop it off in Jerusalem, and he can continue on his way to Rome. That's his plan. Okay? Think a little bit about what do we know about the church in Rome. We do get a little bit of a mention of it earlier on. This is Acts 18, when Paul first arrives in Corinth. It says, there he, Paul, met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. This is kind of an interesting edict. The emperor, Claudius, has kicked all the Jews out of the city of Rome. What has happened here? We don't have a lot of extra-biblical information about this, but one guy, Suetonius, he's a Roman historian, writing a little bit later in the first century. He writes this history of Rome, focusing on the important things that the Caesars were doing. And he writes about the reign of Claudius, that since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome, Claudius. And we say, who is Chrestus? Chrestus is a Roman slave name. I don't know anything about some sort of slave uprising or something going on in Rome. Actually, what most people think here is that he's heard about this. He's not a Christian. He doesn't know much about it. And he's heard people talk about Chrestus, and he hears that as a Latin slave name, when really they're saying a Greek word, Christos. And he doesn't know Greek, he knows Latin, and they're talking about Christos, the Christ. They're talking about Jesus. So this, perhaps, is issues between Jews and Christians, and Jewish Christians, and they get the government involved. He just decides, this is not my problem. I'm not going to deal with this, and just kicks the Jews out of Rome. So that's probably what's going on here. Is actually this is tensions between Jewish Christians and non-Christian Jews, and it's not Chrestus, it's Christos that he's thinking of. So maybe you can put this together as a narrative about the history of Christianity in Rome. That sometime in the 40s, Christianity comes to Rome, spreading among Jewish people like Aquila and Priscilla. That's what we saw in other places with the life of Paul. He's going to these synagogues, and that's really the starting point for the gospel is the Jewish synagogue. So there's a Jewish synagogue in Rome, or multiple ones. We talked a while back about the Jewish diaspora, about how the Jews have spread all through Europe and North Africa, and it's these Jewish communities that give Christianity its first entrance into these cities. So it comes to Rome, just like it's come to many other places. But if the narrative follows what happened to Paul frequently when he starts talking about Jesus in the synagogue, is that some of the Jews don't like it, and they start causing problems. We've seen sometimes in the life of Paul that they actually go to the Roman officials and try to have them do something about the Christians. And generally the Romans say, we don't care. This is a Jewish problem. That's what we saw in Corinth in Acts 18, is the Jews try to bring it to the proconsul Gallio, and he says, this is not an issue for Rome. But Claudius says, this is not my problem, and just gets rid of it. So what we'd have then is if the Jews all get kicked out of Rome, anybody who's left is just the Gentiles. So for some time, perhaps, the church in Rome has been exclusively Gentile, which would be quite different than the situation in most places where, at least in the first century, it seems like the church is predominantly Jewish. And it's this question of how do we let these Gentiles in? But it's really the Jews at the core. Here we have a church, perhaps, that is predominantly, exclusively Gentile. Well, at some point, the edict ends and the Jews go back to Rome. So that would have been at least by Claudius' death in 54, but perhaps he rescinded it before that. By the time Paul is writing Romans, he sends his greetings to Aquila and Priscilla, and that's in chapter 16. So it appears that they have at least been able to return to Rome at this point. But this is perhaps an issue for the church, is going from, started from the Jews, bringing in Gentiles, but then all the Jews get forced out so that it's exclusively Gentile. And now how do you reintegrate these Jewish Christians back into the church life? There's perhaps some issues as you do that. Just any two cultures that try to mix together, you're going to step on each other's toes sometimes. We maybe get some hints of that in the letter to Rome, of how Jewish and Gentile Christians interact and how they view each other. So maybe that is something that Paul is responding to in this letter. But it's an interesting history about what's going on in Rome during this time. Maybe our next question, where's Paul when he's writing this? And for this, we actually have a pretty good answer. If you look at our third journey map, what I call his fundraising journey, and he started in Antioch and went through Galatia. It says he was telling the churches there to set aside money each week so that when he came, he would collect it. He goes to Asia, the big pink area of modern-day Western Turkey, and stays in Ephesus for a couple years. And then writes 1 Corinthians, keeps traveling up into Macedonia, the yellow in the top left, writes 2 Corinthians, and now it appears that he has arrived in Corinth, which is his last stop before going back to Jerusalem. So that's what he's telling the church in Rome. He's got just one last thing, got to deliver the money to Rome, and then I'm coming to Rome. So he's at his last stop. He's in the city of Corinth when he's writing this letter. And this would be his third visit to Corinth. I don't know if it helps you or not. I start getting confused with where he is and where he's writing to, because they end up being a lot of the same locations mixed all together. Maybe this is actually more confusing. I'll let you decide. So when he wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, he was in Corinth the first time. And then he writes 1 Corinthians from Ephesus. 2 Corinthians, not sure exactly where he is. It's somewhere in Macedonia. It could be Philippi or Thessalonica or Berea. And now, when he's writing Romans, he's in Corinth. And later he's going to be in Rome writing Philippians, Ephesians, Colossians. So the cities always get reused. So that makes it confusing. But maybe you can save this chart and it'll help you if you need it. At this point, it is pretty clear. He's in Corinth as he's writing this letter to Rome. Why does Paul send so many greetings? If you look at the letter to Rome, chapter 16, a whole chapter of the book is just him saying hello to people and people who are in Corinth saying hello to the people in Rome. He just lists a whole bunch of names. And once again, compare this to the other books that he's written. So in Romans, he sends greetings from 8 people to 28 people in Rome. And even, it's specific names. There's more if you count, greet, the people who meet at this person's house. far more than any other letter that he's written. And just remember, this is a church where he's never even been there. How does he send so many greetings to and from Rome when he has no relationship with them before this? It's actually led some people to think maybe this chapter was part of Ephesians, because he was been in Ephesus for so long, for years, and he'd know lots of people there, and he doesn't have any greetings in the book of Ephesians. So maybe somehow this chapter got mixed up, and it was supposed to be at the end of Ephesians, and it got put at the end of Romans instead. And it works because some of the same people would be in Ephesus too. There's no evidence for that, so I don't think that's the thing. But maybe if we look at it this way, the book of Colossians is another letter he's writing to a church that he has never visited. I think it's clear as you read Colossians. He's heard about the church. He knows the guy who started it, but he has never been at the church in Colossae. And that's the second most greetings out of any of his letters. And Philemon is in Colossae as well. So it appears the greetings aren't used for places where he has been and knows people. The greetings are a way for him to make connections. It's his way of saying, I know the people in Rome. Like, I know the people you know, and you know the people I know here in Corinth. We're all connected. Even though I've never been there, I want you to know, like, I know lots of people in Rome, and you know lots of people in Corinth, and we're all going to be able to send greetings to each other. So it's not about reaffirming the connections like at Ephesus, where he doesn't need to do that. It's a way of establishing connections to this church that he has never actually been to, but his way of showing that he does know a lot about them. He knows lots of people there. And maybe, I think the greetings are interesting to me. We maybe don't read them when we go through Romans, so we're going to start at the end today with Romans 16. I want to go through some of these greetings because there's some interesting stuff in here, I think. So let's start at the very end of Romans. He says, Erastus, who's the city's director of public works, and our brother Quartus send you their greetings. So Erastus would be the Corinthian director of public works. And actually, we have some interesting archaeological stuff. This is a fairly recent discovery in the last 100 years, which is in this historical period is pretty recent. And if you can read the Latin there, maybe Erastus pro Attalus sua pecunia stravit, that Erastus paid to have this paved out of his own money and from his position of Roman Attalus, which is sort of a treasurer position, like the city's director of public works. And this is in Corinth. And so, first century, very possibly the same Erastus that Paul is mentioning here in Romans. And this is a little bit of external confirmation for that. So that's interesting, I think. What about verse 22? I, Tertius, who wrote this epistle, greet you in the Lord. And you say, well, wait a second. I thought Paul was writing this epistle. But we have to remember, in these times, Paul dictates the letters. He is not a professional writer. He has someone who does the writing. So Tertius is the one who wrote down the letter to Rome as Paul speaks it. The word you can learn for this is a fun word, amanuensis, is the person who writes down people's letters. So Tertius is Paul's amanuensis for the letter to Rome. And he wants to say hi. I think that's kind of fun. He kind of, I don't know, maybe Paul encourages him, saying, well, Tertius, you say hi too. Or if he mentions about, I know some people, can I say something here? But whatever it is, he gets to put his name in the letter and makes it into Scripture. So I think that's fun that we get to learn who wrote this letter. It was Tertius. We don't know anything else about him, though. Let's keep going. Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been a mother to me too. Now, this one it's not so interesting for Paul's mention, but we have another mention of someone named Rufus in the New Testament. Actually, if you read the Gospel of Mark, this is the crucifixion of Jesus, where he says, a certain man from Cyrene, Simon, who is the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross of Jesus. Now, it's interesting. You mentioned Simon, because he's the guy, but why does Mark need to tell us that Simon has two kids named Alexander and Rufus? Unless there's some reason that his audience, that means something to them. It doesn't mean anything to us, but whoever Mark is writing to, it seems like maybe they know who Alexander and Rufus are. Well, you also think, well, Mark, we know he's in Rome with Peter, so this is probably written from Rome. Well, maybe the church in Rome knows about Alexander and Rufus. Maybe they're in Rome, and that would be a connection then. Could that be the same Rufus in Rome that Paul is greeting? So we're kind of speculating here. It could be a different one. But if Mark is mentioning him because he is known to the Christians, it's interesting that this Simon, who just got pulled out of the crowd to carry the cross, actually, from that event, he or his children then end up following Jesus, becoming notable people in the church in Rome. I think that'd be interesting if that's the case. So Rufus, greet Rufus in Rome. All right, we're going to keep going through some greetings here. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my fellow Jews who have been in prison with me. They're outstanding among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was. I'll mention a couple things here. First, that they've been in prison with Paul. You're familiar with Paul being in prison, but actually, by this point in the story, the only recorded prison stay has been that one night with Paul and Silas. But from his own description, he has been in prison before. And not just that one night with Silas, if Andronicus and Junia were there. We also see a mention of this in 2 Corinthians, where he's comparing himself and talking about his sufferings, and one of those is prison. So Luke hasn't mentioned it, but Paul has already suffered some of these things, including time in prison for his Christian faith. So this is just a little reminder of that. But the other thing is that Paul considers Andronicus and Junia apostles. We think, Junia, that's a female name. There's female apostles? How do you feel about having women apostles? Well, let's think about this for a second. One idea could be, this is not a female apostle. This is actually a male name, Junius. When Paul writes this sentence, he actually can't tell from his writing if this is a male, masculine name or a feminine name. They would be written the same way, but you would pronounce them differently. So that just the way Greek works, in this sentence, they'd be spelled the same way. So maybe it's this name, Junius, and it's not a female apostle. This is a male apostle. So it could be, but Junius is not a very common male name. And actually, Junia at this time would have been a very common female name. This combination of male name Andronicus and female name, that makes sense for a husband and wife couple anyway. So it seems like it would be a feminine name here. So can a woman be an apostle? Do you have a problem with that? maybe it depends on, what do you mean by an apostle? It has different meanings depending on what you're talking about. So one sense of the word we mean is the 12. We know all of these are men, so it's not, Andronicus isn't one of the 12 either. So that's not the meaning. So those are all men. We don't have to worry about that. The word just means sent, a person who is sent. So it could just mean, she's like a missionary. Like this is a missionary couple like Paul and Barnabas are missionaries. It's the same word structure. Missionary is someone who is sent. Apostle is someone who is sent. So it could just be a general sense of the word here. Actually, though, if you read the way Paul writes about apostles, especially 1 Corinthians 15, he talks about apostles as people who have seen the resurrected Jesus. And so that's how he considers himself to be an apostle, is because on the road to Damascus, he encountered the resurrected Jesus. And that's what lets him be the least of the apostles, he says. But there in 1 Corinthians 15, he mentions other people. He mentions the 12 and Peter, but then he mentions James and the other apostles who witnessed the resurrection. And so if it's this sense, apostle is someone who saw the resurrected Jesus. We actually know there are lots of women. The first people who see Jesus are women. And even one of those women is named Johanna. That'd be a Hebrew name. We know lots of people who, living in this multicultural area, adopt a Greek name as well. And so maybe we're getting more speculative here, but this Johanna, who is one of the first women to see Jesus, maybe she picked a name, a Greek-sounding name Greek name that sounded like Johanna, and she picked Junia. I don't know. That's just an idea. But there is that possibility that an apostle is someone who has seen Jesus. It's not something to get upset about. So I'm not too concerned if Junia is an apostle. Okay, let's keep going. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church in Cenchrea. Now we've got another issue. I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of his people, and to give her any help she may need from you, for she has been the benefactor of many people, including me. Now, we'll get into the deacon of the church here in a second, but the first thing to notice is this word commend. This is sort of the Bible way of saying she is the one who is delivering the letter. So that's the first thing we notice is Paul sends this letter, and he's not going to put it in the mail. He has to have someone who actually hand carries this letter to the church in Rome. And in many of his letters, you can see who this person is who is doing it. And in this case, it appears to be Phoebe, who is the one who is delivering this letter, that she maybe had some business in Rome. And so he said, well, here's a letter. Can you have this brought to the church there? So he does. He speaks very highly of her. But we get to this deacon of the church. Now, we said, we're not sure about a female apostle, but how do you feel about a female deacon? There's no twisting. Maybe this is actually a man. It says our sister Phoebe. This is pretty clearly a woman. What do you think about a female deacon of the church? Well, we have the same thing. What does the word deacon mean? And so we do have this reference to a position in the church alongside the elders or overseers, mentioned in Philippians, mentioned in 1 Timothy. That's one possibility for the word deacon, but it has a literal meaning too. It just means a servant. And so anyone who is serving is a deacon. So it could be that Paul, he's not saying she's a church official, that she's a servant, just as all of us strive to be. And so that's a possibility. I think it's interesting. In the NIV, here they put 2 footnotes at the word deacon in Romans 16. And the first one says, a deacon is a servant. And the second footnote says, deacon refers to the Christian position, or the church position. So they have these 2 footnotes that point to both of these explanations, and they're just going to leave them here contradicting each other as to what it means in this passage as separate footnotes. I think that's impressive. So if you don't like the idea of a female position, female holding the position of deacon, deaconess in the church, then you probably want to opt for that second one. Although you do read 1 Timothy, and it is a little strange how it comes out when he's giving these list of qualifications for elders and deacons. He starts off with the elders, the overseers, and gives the list there in verse 2. In verse 8, he says, in the same way, deacons are to be, and he lists the qualifications for a deacon. And then verse 11, in the same way, the women. And here the footnote says, it could be female deaconesses or the deacons' wives. So you have the same choice depending on what you want. But it's interesting, he didn't give any qualifications for elders' wives up in the initial section. And so some people would say, well, he goes, instructions for elders, and then deacons, and then deaconesses. But then he switches back to deacons there at the end about, this is clearly talking about males. They must be faithful to their wives. So I'm not sure what to do with that, but we do have Phoebe, a deacon of the church, or perhaps a servant of the church, depending on what you want to do with that. How are we doing on time? We okay? We've got through 1 chapter. Looks like we have about 12 minutes, so we need to maybe move a little faster. But we maybe learned something here about Paul's greetings to the church in Rome. I hope you found something there that you've never encountered before. I'm just going to go real quickly through the rest of the book. We've studied this before. You've been in classes on the book of Romans, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. Partly the issue is that if I get started, you just can keep going as deep as you want. So I'm intentionally just going to scratch the surface here. If I were outlining the book of Romans, it's a difficult one to outline because it's a very well-constructed argument. And he's moving from argument to argument in a very smooth, flowing way. So we won't get really bullet points here. But I would say, broadly speaking, the first 4 chapters are God's plan to make things right. His plan for righteousness is the way it comes out in the text. Chapters 5 through 8 have a contrast, actually multiple contrasts, between the old humanity, which he talks about as Adam, as sin, as flesh, and the new humanity, which he talks about as Jesus. He talks about spirit, and then he gets into a whole thing about how the Spirit enables people to live. Then chapters 9 through 11, he's asking the question, well, what about Israel? It's an interesting question for this church that has been predominantly Gentile and now has these Jews coming back into it and say, well, what was God's point with Israel, and why, if this is true, why aren't the Jews accepting it? That's part of what he's getting there. He's got some practical, ethical things to say in chapters 12 through 15, and then the greetings we've covered them. We've got that, no problem. Okay, well we're gonna rapid speed here. My summary of the book of Romans. And I apologize, there's always more to say. He starts off, and this is a familiar way of talking about the gospel to us, where we start with the problem before you get to the good news. You got to really hit the bad news here first. And he starts off, the nations have obviously failed to reflect God's glory. That even though they're created in the image of God, they have chosen to worship things that are not God. They've chosen to worship idols. And for Paul, the implications of idolatry are this degradation of of everything else. That they become filled with all of these other sins because of their idolatry. And this is despite the fact that God created them with this sense of what was right and what was wrong. They've neglected that by going after idols instead. He moves in, well, did the Jews, who God told very clearly what he wanted, did they do any better? And Paul says, no. You look at the history of Israel, and they still chose sin and idolatry, despite the fact that God made it very clear what he expected. So we ask, well, what was the point of Israel? And Paul says, well, they've served to pass on this story, the stories of creation, of what this world is like, the stories of Abraham and Moses, of God continually rescuing and providing for his people. They've preserved that in Scripture for the benefit of the church. And even with this law that they have, it has served a purpose of pointing out the shortcomings of humanity, the gap between what people have done and what God has asked them to do. So he wraps up this argument with to say both groups, Jews and Gentiles, are under the power of sin. However, God has made people right through the faithful obedience of Jesus. Now we get in here, a very familiar couple verses, Romans 3, 21, 22. Now apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. This righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. Now, we hit this in Galatians. I'll mention it again here, that when we have this phrase, faith in Jesus Christ, that in the Greek there is no word in between faith and Jesus. That's one. It is a possible translation, but it's not the only translation, and I don't think the most obvious one, especially when we have this word at the end, believe, which is the same as the word faith. It's just the verb form instead of the noun. So we don't notice the connection when we translate the word in two different ways. But it seems if you say through faith in Jesus Christ to those who have faith, we're being a little bit awkward or redundant by saying it twice. And so the translation that I prefer, that's growing more prevalent in our English translations as well, is not the faith in Jesus Christ, but the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. And then to show the connection to all who believe, to all who show faith. So when it say, if you would say you're saved by the faithfulness of Jesus, and as that has happened, your response is faith in Jesus. So that second part still gets our faith in Jesus. I don't think that's in question. Maybe the nuance is it's first of all the faithfulness of Jesus that we respond to with our own faith. And so I think the same thing in Galatians, the same thing in Philippians. I think this makes the passage more understandable for us with just a little bit of a change in nuance. Okay? All right, we got 5 minutes. Romans 4. Paul goes into the example of Abraham. Why did God choose Abraham? Well, it's not because he was a Jew and didn't have the ethnic markers of being a Jew. Circumcision, well, no, that was after God chose him. The law, well, that was hundreds of years later. It wasn't either one of those things that people cling to as part of their Jewish identity. but God considered Abraham righteous because of Abraham's faithful obedience. We get into this second section about the contrast, just to kind of highlight some of the ways he does it. Is, Adam introduces the spread of sin and death. Jesus introduces the spread of righteousness and life. In the old system, we were slaves to sin, but now we're slaves to obedience. In the old way, we were living by the flesh, and now we're living by the Spirit. And he goes into that in chapter 18 about how when we think about your life in the Spirit, that's what helps us to endure our present sufferings. Okay? The last major section that we'll talk about this morning is what about Israel? Chapters 9 through 11. Paul's argument, I think, goes something like this. That God works throughout history by selecting some and hardening others. He gives some examples of this from the Old Testament, that God chose Isaac and Jacob for his promise, but he did not choose their brothers, Ishmael or Esau. And he mentions how he hardened Pharaoh. He gives the analogy of a piece of pottery isn't the one who gets to decide if the potter's doing a good job or not. So if humanity thinks that's not fair, that's not their decision to make. And so he goes through now quoting the Old Testament to show this, that it was God's plan to select Gentiles, and he quotes Hosea to do that. And he talks about that from Israel, there would only be a remnant who would choose to believe, who would choose to accept Jesus. That's from the book of Isaiah. And that it's these Jews who are the beautiful feet who bring good news to the Gentiles, Jews like Paul himself. And that the Jews who accept Jesus are like the faithful in the days of Elijah. When Elijah asked, I'm all alone, and God says, no, that I've got many people who are faithful. And that's the comparison Paul makes here. And finally, Paul brings up this analogy of a tree, an olive tree, where God has broken off dead branches. These are the Jews who did not believe in Jesus. But some of the branches did believe, and so they are preserved on the tree. And now he's brought in these new wild olive branches and grafted them into the tree. These are the Gentiles who he's brought into his kingdom. And yet Paul says, it's still possible for those branches that got broken off to be grafted back in themselves. And they'd actually, they'd even survive better than these wild ones, because they came straight from this same tree, that if they ever got put back on, they would flourish. And so his idea is that these Jews have rejected Jesus right now, but the invitation is still open for them to come. And here he writes, I don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. And this has caused lots of puzzlement for people because we wonder, what does he mean that all Israel will be saved? Either he doesn't mean what we think by all, and he really means all who are faithful, all who choose to believe, which is not the most natural meaning of all, or he somehow shifted the meaning of Israel here. So now he's no longer talking about the Israel that he mentioned a couple words before, but he's shifted now to the spiritual Israel, the church. I don't like that explanation either, because he's made this whole point about Israel being grafted back in. He's talking about people coming back. So I don't know what he's saying here. We'll come back to it in the prayer in just a minute. But I do think it's a mystery, as he says. Let me set us up for next week. Our next topic is back to the travels, Paul will leave Corinth to deliver the collection to Jerusalem. And for a person who is so clearly concerned with the Jewish people, as he shows in the book of Romans, what could go wrong when he gets to Jerusalem? That's foreshadowing. Something is going to go wrong. We have to find out next week. But let's close with this prayer, where Paul mentions this mystery of how the Jews could be saved, the Jews that he cares so much about. He admits this is up to God, and he doesn't understand it. So let's close with this prayer. Oh, the depths of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out. Who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counselor? Who has ever given to God that God should repay them? For from him and through him and for him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. Well, we'll pick up next week with Paul's continued travels. Thanks for your attention this week.